I've had this idea to build the love child of a rounded waterfall edge cabinet and a modern table for a while now. So today, let's find out what that mashup looks like in real life and decide if it's a relationship worth pursuing. I'm Timber Biscuit. Alright, so like I said at the start, the goal for today is to build a mashup between a modern waterfall edge cabinet as well as a table. And that may sound a little strange because you don't usually see a cabinet smashed into a table, but that's kind of what I'm going for with this piece. And the idea behind that is that you could set this table next to a chair or a reading area, and the cabinet can store your books or your iPad, that kind of thing, while you could rest your coffee on the table. The other goal that I have in mind for this one is that I want it to be able to sit in the center of a room, because I know not everyone can just rest their chair against the wall or put it in the corner. So I want this piece to look good from the front, back, and obviously the two sides, all while still being cohesive throughout the design. So that's a lot of little challenges that I have to overcome with this one, but I think that we're on the right path. So for this one, I'm going to be using walnut and white oak, which you see me cutting down to rough length now. And since the end goal for this one's a pretty complex table, I'm going to be using 4/4 and 8/4 stock. Now, as many viewers of the channel already know, I love using walnut on my projects. In fact, I use it in about 95% of them. But in a lot of recent projects, I've been using cherry, and I'm switching that up today for some white oak. And that's because I think that it'll give this piece a bit more contrast. Plus, I've used white oak on a few other projects on the channel in the past, and I really like how the grain pattern of white oak and walnut complement one another. It's not just a contrast of color, there's also a great contrast within the grain pattern itself. Texture-wise, they're both pretty similar with a medium grain, with white oak being a little coarser, but walnut tends to have a more curly grain pattern and white oak's is a lot more straight, and since we're already doing some fun pairings, I think it'll work well for this one. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let's just take a quick look at the design. Now, I want to be clear that the design here is not going to be the final piece. What I did here was just sketch out the broader strokes, and I'll figure out the finer details while I'm in the shop. There's going to be a lot of little details that we'll cover throughout the video, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how I want the piece to work. Between all the angles, the splayed legs, and the rounded case, there's a lot of challenges within this piece, so we'll cross those bridges when we get there. Covering all those details now would be like Orion's belt, a waste of space. And that's a terrible joke. Only 3 stars. Alright, so now that we've got our goals and our first dad joke in the books, we can get to laying out our panels. What I like to do when laying out panels is just find a grain pattern relationship between my boards that makes sense. I'm not looking to alternate growth rings and patterns like I see other people do on videos. Here, I'm just really looking for what I think looks good. And once I find my layout, I mark it out with a triangle so I know where all my boards will go back, and then I mark each edge with an I and an O for in and out, meaning that I'm going to face that edge in or out when I joint them. And that's so that if there's any variance on my joiner, say my fence is at 90.1 degrees, those angles will offset and create a nice tight joint. So once I have my panels marked out and my boards jointed, I can then take those jointed boards over to my table saw and cut a fresh edge on them. Now, most of the edges I'm cutting here are not going to meet up with one another because the majority of my panels are only 2 boards wide. But what this does is it gives me right angle reference points for my glue up, as well as gives me a nice straight edge for when I cut these boards down to their final width later on. Now, with all that being said, a few of these boards are going to make up some of my other parts of my cabinet as well as my table. Since there's a lot of details that are within the table, I'm just going to rough cut all those pieces now, making sure that I leave plenty of room, both lengthwise and widthwise, to get to my final sizes. As I've said in the past, I'm not a huge fan of working off of cut lists, but we can get pretty close with these pieces now. So with my 4/4 stock all cut down, I can focus on the larger 8/4 stock. And normally I don't cut and mill pieces unless I'm planning on using them right away. I want to cut and mill them oversized now so that if there is any movement within them, I can address that right away. Now, most of the lumber I use in my projects has been either sitting in my shop or in a shop just up the road for at least a couple of weeks. So for the most part, they're acclimated to my climate. In any case, it's either best to mill and use your lumber right away, or mill it oversized so that if it does move, you have plenty of space to get back to your final dimension. Insert Highlander joke here. But all jokes aside, with that, our milling was done, and we can get to assembling some of these panels. Now, I like to use dominoes when I'm assembling panels, and that's just because it makes my glue ups more consistent. I've done plenty of glue ups without dominoes, and they've turned out just fine, but when I'm working on something like a cabinet that's going to have a wraparound grain pattern, and I want that to be really consistent, I think it's important to go ahead and just take the time to plunge a couple mortises to make sure that the panels stay flat. Again, this isn't a must, but the added 45 minutes it takes me to do this is well worth it for me. But the biggest thing to be mindful of is where those dominoes exist within the panels. Since again we're going with a wraparound grain pattern and we're going to be cutting our tabletop out, we obviously don't want those dominoes to interfere with any of those cuts. Otherwise you'll expose the domino and that would suck. Ask anyone who's used a domino, it's probably happened to them before. So again here I'll opt for that consistency, I'm just mindful of my placement. Just like I've been telling people the benefits of eating dried grapes. You know, raising awareness. Alright, so next it was time to get all my panels glued up. And to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and tap in my dominoes and then use some parallel clamps to clamp my panels together. Now here, I'm not super worried about making sure that the tenon and mortise are filled with glue. Again, they're more there just for alignment to make sure that my top faces will be nice and flat. So once I have one panel done, I could go ahead and repeat that process for the remaining 4. Now, luckily I have enough parallel clamps to just knock all these guys out, but if I didn't, I would just go back and do them in batches. And just as a quick side note, whenever you are gluing up panels, it's important to use a nice flat reference surface like this table that I just built to give your panels the best chance of staying flat. One other thing that I find that really helps is to put 1 or 2 clamps on the opposite side so that you distribute more of that clamping pressure across the board. Otherwise, when you pull your panels out of clamps, they're probably going to be bowed, which is about as traumatic as my wife ripping the covers off me while we were sleeping last night. Don't worry, I recovered. And if you like woodworking and fatherly fun jokes like I do, hit like so the video can spread to more people. I appreciate your support. Alright, with my panels out of clamps, I can go ahead and get to work on our cabinet carcass. So the first thing I'm going to do is just use my table saw to rip all the boards down to an even width. Now here I'm shooting for an oversized width because I'm going to hand plane down to my final size later on, so we want to get to within about a 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters for my European viewers. So once I have my 2 cabinet panels ripped down to their rough width, I went ahead and swapped in my ripping blade for a crosscut blade. And now we're going to work on those wraparound miters. Now, to cut miters like this, I like to use a sled, but you could also cut these using a miter gauge. I just think it's a little bit more difficult to do that given the length and width of these boards. Plus, I already have this sled that's dedicated to cutting 45s because I use them so frequently in my furniture that it only makes sense to use it. So my process for cutting wraparound or waterfall miters goes like this. To start off, I made sure to cut as close as I could to the center of my 2 boards that made up these 2 panels. This way the material removed from the center miter joint will be hidden pretty well within the cut. From there, what I do is measure and mark out my panel lengths. Now again, the goal is to make these miter cuts as close as possible to one another. But due to the nature of cutting miters out of one single board, they're going to need to alternate. And what I mean by that is when I cut the first miter, I'm going to have to flip the panel over to cut the second. This way the boards will match up and give me that continuous grain pattern look. So once I cut my first miter, I just rotate the panel and then cut my second miter. And I do that for each panel, working my way around the carcass. Now, my last 2 miters are not going to match up because they're at opposite ends of the tree, but that's okay. What I'll do is hide those on the bottom of the case and no one will ever see them. So with all my miters cut, I just quickly assemble the box, making sure to mark the back end so that I know where my rabbets are going to go. I can't stress enough how important it is to mark out as much as you need to for any one project. I put a lot of notes on my boards, and that just helps me to stay organized. Next up, I can go ahead and cut the dados that are going to support the shelves within the carcass. So to do that, I first install my 1/2-inch discs of death and then mark out where those dados are going to live. Now I'm only going to do this on one board to start, and then I'm going to transfer those dados directly onto my other board. This just gives me a better chance of having things lined up rather than just relying on measurements alone. Now, if these boards were smaller, I would just tape them together and cut both dados at the same time, but again, we're working with pretty wide panels here. One other thing I'm doing here is again using a sled for my dados, and that again is due to the width of these panels. If they were smaller, I would just use a miter gauge, but with them being this large, a sled helps out a lot. And the key to success with long dados like this is just to have consistent pressure across your entire cut. This way you'll have less to clean out with a router plane later on, and you'll get much better results right from the start. Which is about as good as my talent for predicting what's inside a wrapped present. It's a gift. Alright, so with my dados cut, I can move on to the rabbets, which are going to be a slightly smaller width. So I went ahead and removed 2 of my blades and cut the rabbets onto the back edge of my panels. Here we don't want to go too deep because all the edges and miters of this carcass are going to be rounded over at the end of the project to give us a really rounded out look. So the rabbets for this back panel will sit within that tolerance. And don't worry, that'll all make sense when we get there. And since I have my sacrificial fence attached, I could go ahead and cut the tenons for my shelves. Here I'm going to hold off on cutting the rabbets for the rear panel until the carcass is assembled. This way I can pull the dimensions directly off the case. So my dados right off the table saw are a little tight, so I'll just use a shoulder plane to remove a little material from the shoulder and get a nice snug fit for all the dados. Now I used to try to nail my joinery right off the table saw, but I gotta tell you that that's extremely difficult. It's much easier in my opinion to use hand tools to really finesse those edges. While I love machine woodworking as much as the next guy, I feel like they only get me 3/4 of the way there. I like to finish that last quarter using hand tools because I can finesse and really fine fit those parts. The only thing to really watch out for when working with hand tools is tear out, because it's a lot easier to tear out using hand tools than it is with machine tools. And that's because when you get into an area where you're working against the grain, it's really easy to push a little too hard and rip those fibers. So my best advice is to take light passes and work with the grain until you get to your desired depth. Alright, so because I'm going to be rounding these miters over later on, the next thing I wanted to do was apply some dominoes into the miter joints themselves. Now normally I like to use dominoes just to help me with the assembly of mitered cases, but in this case, no pun intended, they're actually there for a bit of structure. So all I do is mark out their location and plunge the mortises. Next it was time to address some of the knots that were in the walnut. Now again, I've gone over this a couple times in other videos, but just to put my 2 cents in, I'm not a huge fan of using epoxy in woodworking. That is unless I'm using it for something practical, like glue or filling knots in a board or creating laminations. I know the woodworking community is kind of divided on that one, but that's just where I stand. And it's okay if you don't agree, we can still be friends. So once I had my epoxy, dye, and fast hardener mixed together, I went ahead and poured it into my knots. Now because earlier I backed the knots with some painter's tape, I shouldn't get any leaks, and we should be good to go. So after that I just hit it with a blowtorch really quick to remove any surface bubbles, and then I let the epoxy harden overnight. And then the next day I could come back in the shop and give my panels a quick sanding. Now when I'm sanding panels prior to a glue up, I try to do my best to avoid any of the joints so that I don't remove any material prior to the glue up. It's better to wait until after you glue them up to sand those areas so that you don't affect any of your fits. And speaking of the glue up, let's go ahead and get this carcass assembled. So the first thing I like to do when using dominoes for my miters, just go ahead and tap in those dominoes into my larger panels. This way I'm only working with trying to fit the smaller ones, and it makes things a little bit less stressful during the glue up. The other thing I like to do is use glue with a long open time. This way I have plenty of time to get all my parts together, and I'm not stressing frantically trying to get things to fit. At least that's the plan. And usually that works out. One other thing I like to do is just practice my glue ups before I actually do them. Yes, just like OAI, we're talking about practice. It's an oldie but a goodie. So with my 2 case sides attached, I could go ahead and drop my shelves into their dados. And as you can see here, that little bit of material we removed earlier gives us plenty of room for that joint to fit with a little bit of glue. And then from there, I can just tap the joints closed and then apply a bunch of clamps. And I'll speed that up a bit since applying a bunch of clamps like this is as much of a pain in the butt as cheap toilet paper. So with about 16 clamps attached, that should do. So while the glue dried, I went ahead and cut down my panels for my tabletop as well as the front and back panels for the carcass. Now here again, I'm going to leave the carcass panels oversized so that I can plane back to their final dimension later on. So once I had ripped down all my remaining parts to their rough width, I could go ahead and install my crosscut blade so I could cut them down to their rough length. Now there's a couple of different parts that I'm going to cut out here. We have our more decorative pieces that are going to act as supports for our tabletop. We got our rails. We've got our rear panel, our front panel, which is also our door, and we have our tabletop and our lower decorative support. Now my tabletop and lower decorative tray are both going to be made of white oak. Everything else is going to be walnut. So during this process, I'm trying to be as conservative as I can with my material. I definitely don't want to overcut and have to remake any of these panels, and though I do have a little bit of extra walnut, I don't actually have any extra white oak, so here I really want to pay attention. And as you can see by my next copy impression, we don't have a ton of offcuts from this project, so I think we're doing pretty good. The other thing I'm really watching out for is those dominoes. We don't want to cut into any of those, which again is why I carefully laid out my pieces earlier. Alright, so with my remaining parts cut down to the rough length and width, I could go ahead and quickly sand everything down. Since the rest of my joints are going to have some pretty tight tolerances, I think it's best to sand these down now so that we don't affect the fit later on. So the next step was to measure and then cut the rear panels adjoining rabbet joint. Again, this is made a lot easier now that our case is all assembled. So what I'll do here is just use my dado stack and a sacrificial fence to cut that rabbet along the border of my rear panel. So while I wrap that up, let me just take a quick second to say that if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more videos like it, make sure you subscribe. I make new videos about woodworking projects, tips, and tricks all the time, so subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you do, trust me, I won't drag out my dad jokes. This just isn't where those belong. So with my rabbet all cut out, I could again use my shoulder plane and a router plane to clean up the joint. Here, what I'm going for is a nice even fit all the way around the rear panel. It's okay if the rabbet is too shallow, but if it's too deep, then there will be a good connection all the way around and I won't get a tight joint. So the next step to get a nice tight fit is to use my hand plane around the rear edge of the carcass. What this does is it removes all those saw marks and imperfections and gives me a nice crisp edge for that rabbet joint. Again, this is why I left this panel wide earlier. It's so that I could remove about a 32nd of an inch from this side and then flip the entire carcass over and remove another 32nd from the other side. Now the 32nd of an inch, or 0.75 millimeters I guess, is a bit arbitrary. What I'm going for is really just a nice smooth edge. On furniture pieces like this, I don't build to perfectly match my plan. Instead I build to what feels and looks right. So if my measurements change a little bit throughout the project, that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything if my width is a 32nd of an inch larger, or even a 1/4 inch larger. I build within those tolerances to make sure that all my parts are cohesive and work together. Alright, so next it was time to lay out the templates for my supports, as well as the edge treatment for the tabletop and the tray. Now I went ahead and cut these out off camera on my CNC because it saves me a lot of time and I honestly haven't used it in a while. So what I'm first going to do is just use a pencil to lay out and mark out my template shape. Now for the tabletop, I'm going with a symmetrical concave curve on each side. So since the width is different from my length, that required me to cut out a few more templates. Next, I can take my pieces over to the bandsaw and rough cut them out. Here I'm aiming for a 32nd to a 1/16 of an inch of extra overhang so I don't get too close to my line and end up cutting into my work. I think it's at this point where I get really excited about a project. For some reason, when I get to the bandsaw and I start cutting out my shapes and my parts become more unique, it feels like the piece just really starts to come together. It's at this part that I can start imagining where these parts are going to go, and I can start picking and choosing which pieces are my favorite. So in these decorative pieces, for instance, I can use either one on the front or the back, but I honestly don't start making that decision until I start seeing my pieces in their final format. It's easy enough for me to guess where things are going to go, and usually I do, but it's at this point right here where I've trimmed things out at the bandsaw and I'm using the router table that I can really start to find my parts. Just like that guy who stole that copy of Microsoft Office from me. I'll find you. You have my word. Alright, so with my templates attached to my rough cut parts with some double stick tape, I can use my compression flush trim bit to route out the parts. And the reason I'm using a compression bit here is because I'm going uphill and downhill on the grain. And a compression bit really reduces the amount of tear out you'll get when you go against the grain. Not to mention here, I'm routing a ton of end grain as well, which can produce a ton of tear out. And in my experience, a compression bit can almost eliminate that. And I only say almost because there's always that time where even under the best of circumstances, something's going to tear out. Luckily, I didn't have any of that happen here, but I just want to be honest with you. No bit's perfect, a compression bit gets pretty darn close. And if you're interested in checking out the one I'm using here, I'll leave a link down in the description. Alright, so this part was pretty straightforward. All I did was work my way around my parts, flush trimming as I went. Until the end where I had all my pieces flush trimmed out, and I could move on to some of the edge treatments. So for the underside of the tabletop and the lower support, I want to have a pretty steep bevel. And the only way to really achieve a steep bevel is to use a table saw. You could use a router bit, but they get pretty pricey when you get to the 60-degree level. And honestly, I don't think they look as good as the bevel you can get from a table saw. So what I use is a tenon jig that just slides along my table saw's fence, and it gives me a really tall reference surface to clamp to so that I can cut that really steep bevel. Now since my tabletop and support are curved, the bevel's not going to be perfectly straight across the entire bottom, which I'm okay with. I think it gives it a cool tapered look towards the center while keeping the ends a little wider, which again, I think is a nice detail. So the next step in the process was to cut the joinery that would attach the tabletop and the support to the side of my cabinet. And to do that, I'll again turn to the domino. Now, I could have gone with something like a dado here as well, but I decided that the domino joint looks a lot more seamless, and I wanted to make sure that this piece didn't really have any intrusive lines in the front. I want the tabletop to have an illusion that it's floating, and a dado joint would kind of ruin that effect. The only real issue here is that this is end grain to straight grain, but I have a ton of support that's going to go beneath this joint between the legs, the stretchers, and the lower support piece, so I'm not all that worried about it. And at the end of the day, this isn't a dining table or a stool that's going to need to support a ton of weight. I think a lot of people overthink the joinery on furniture, but if you think about the intended use for the piece, then this type of decision becomes a little less stressful. But we're all guilty of doing it, so let me know down in the comments what piece you've over-engineered. So what I did was just reference off my tabletop to find the spacing for the lower support, and then I could plow in those mortises. Again here, this is another good example of using your workpiece to get your measurements rather than looking at a plan. I know that I say that a ton, but it's probably one of the most important lessons I've ever learned in woodworking. And it works way better than the skeleton rule of measurement. You know, graveyards. Alright, so the next step was to splay out those center decorative supports. And to do that, I'll just set my table saw to 67 degrees and then use my miter gauge to trim that down. Now in this project, there's a lot of strange angles to work with, but at the end of the day, it breaks out of that square frame, and I think it makes the piece a little bit more interesting. And my hope is to achieve a more updated mid-century look. Not to mention, these types of details will add some depth and some character to the piece, which makes it feel more unique. So again here, I'm just using my pieces to dictate where the joinery should go. So once I've got my angles laid out, I just kind of arbitrarily mark where the dominoes should go. I'm not looking for any one specific measurement here, I just want to make sure that they're hidden. The only thing I really had to be mindful of was that thinner area of the decorative support. I had to change the depth of my mortise so that I didn't plunge all the way through, but after a few minutes, I counted up, we had 10 dominoes, and I could do my first dry assembly. Now, whenever I'm dry assembling a piece for the first time, I like to take my time with it to make sure I'm not just bashing my joints together. There's a small possibility that these are off slightly, so we don't want to break anything in the process. Now, thankfully, everything lined up for me, so I didn't have to worry about that. So yeah, I'd say we're pretty good. So next it was time to get to work on our splayed legs. Now because I'm splaying my legs out, they're going to need a compound miter. So I'm going to set both my angles on my miter saw to 15 degrees and make the cut. And after I make that initial cut, I'm going to take my measurement from the top of that cut down to the bottom so that I know where my next cut needs to go. Now this piece does involve a bit of math, so I did rely on my plan for this. Splayed legs are really tricky to figure out, which is why I cut an extra piece for this entire process. And I think that's a pretty good tip. Anytime you're going into something you're unsure about, it's always best to cut an extra piece. This way if you mess up the first one, you have something else to go back to. And the other thing I'll say is just trust your measurements. Again, there's a lot of math involved with creating a piece like this, so I heavily rely on my measurements for these types of parts. If there is anything off about these legs down the line, say they're a 1/16 of an inch shorter or longer than they're supposed to be, I can always trim that back later on. So here we're just shooting for as close as we can possibly get. And once I had all my parts cut, I could hold them up with a square and do my best to hold things together to see how we did. And I think this will work. Alright, so the next step in the process was to attach the shorter legs to the bottom of my cabinet. And to do that, I'm going to use double floating tenons. Now, the reason I go with double here is just so that there's less twist in the leg. Plus, there's a 15-degree angle on these guys, so it's going to pivot a bit more, and we want to make sure we can try to avoid that twist as much as possible. So again, here, the domino makes pretty quick work of those tenons. I am using some longer tenons here, so I'm going to plunge my mortises much deeper into the leg pieces than I am into the case. And that's just because I want to use the whole domino. If I needed them to be any shorter, I could always trim them down, but for this I don't think it's really necessary. Plus I feel like the deeper it goes into these mortises, the better the connection. So once I have my case pieces done, I went ahead and repeated that same process for my lower support. Now it's also important to note that because of the angle, the legs don't run straight or horizontal across the front of the case. They're kind of cocked slightly towards the center on both faces, so for that angle I just split the difference and plunged the mortise into my support. And that technique definitely passed the eyeball test. From there we could reassemble all of our pieces to see how the legs turned out. And for this point in the project, they're close enough. So next it was time to give these legs some taper. Now normally I'll taper legs from top to bottom, with the bottom getting thinner while the top stays thicker. But with this piece, I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to drop that taper so that the legs have a more grounded feel. Plus we're going to add a teardrop accent towards the lower part of the foot, so that's going to give us more space to really carve in that detail. So to cut in my initial taper, all I'm going to do is make a quick sled over at the table saw. So once I have my sled dimension down and my fence locked in place, I went ahead and used my leg measurements as a reference piece to set up my reference blocks. From there, I just screw those directly into the sled and then attach some hold down clamps. These hold down clamps are great, they're easy to use, and I use them on a ton of different projects. Again, I'll drop a link for anyone who wants to check them out. Now I know a lot of folks keep dedicated sleds for tapers in their shop, but honestly setting one up only takes about 5 minutes and it takes less space up in the shop, so I just make a sled each time I need to cut a taper. Plus doing it this way also gives me the perfect support and stops that I need for each piece, so it just works out. The one thing to watch out for when you are cutting tapers is the flying off cut. It seems to always wedge itself in between the blade and the zero clearance insert, even if it is a zero clearance insert. You can rely on it happening just about every time, just like your most reliable body part. You can always count on your fingers. So with the wedge removed, I could go ahead and cut in that same taper onto my lower leg pieces. Granted, this is without the projectile warning. So next I needed to make a quick template to get that teardrop effect on the bottom of the legs that we talked about earlier. And to do that, I just traced out the bottom of the leg onto some plywood, and then marked out the height that I wanted for my teardrop, and then used a French curve to create the curve. From there, I could take the template over to my bandsaw to cut it out. I did give myself a couple different options for the shape, so once I cut out the first piece, I went ahead and looked at where it sat on the bottom of the leg, and decided that it was good to go as is, but if it wasn't, I had a secondary curve that I could have cut if I wanted it deeper. From there I can just take my template and then trace out those lines on the inside part of my legs. Now while I could use a router and a flush trim bit with this template to get these legs perfect, I don't think it's fully necessary. I instead chose to cut them out manually over the bandsaw. And that's because I don't think that these need to be perfect. They just need to be pretty darn close. So a bandsaw allows me to get close enough, and then I can finish finessing these curves by hand over at the bench. The only thing that was tricky is that since there is a taper on there, after I made the first cut, the leg was lifted off the table a bit, so I just had to make sure I had good pressure across the flat parts so that I didn't come up with some squirrely angle across the bottom. So with that lower teardrop shape carved in, I could then take the legs over to my bench and use my random orbit sander to really smooth out that curve. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not going for any perfect measurement here, I'm just going for that eyeball test. As soon as the curves look natural and symmetrical, I stop. And then from there I can go ahead and hand plane the flat parts of the legs. This removes any saw marks and really smooths out the leg so that when we go ahead and do the edge treatments later, we have a really flat reference surface. The other thing is that a hand plane gives us a much smoother surface than we could ever get with sanding. So once I have my really smooth surface, I go ahead and just take my hand sander to round over that final edge. This gives us a nice transition from the flat to the curve and makes it look pretty seamless. So with all 4 faces of all 4 legs planed and sanded down, I could go ahead and start addressing the feet. Now on every furniture piece I build, I try to highlight the chamfering of feet, because I feel like it's super important to the longevity of a piece of furniture. The 10 or 15 minutes it takes to chamfer all these edges over on the bottom of the feet could save this piece from breaking in the future, so I think it's well worth it. Next up, it was time to address the rails. And just like the legs, these are going to be a compound miter. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of showing you how I found these angles, because honestly, it was a lot of tedious work and trial and error. What I like to do is just use an offcut that's of similar size and shape, like 3/4 inch plywood that I use for these, and then I test my angles before cutting them on my actual workpiece. And that's because each leg is kind of unique. This bevel you're seeing here, for instance, is at 2.5 degrees, whereas the adjoining bevel is at 3 degrees. And that's not because there's something dramatically off, that just has to do with the placement of the dominoes. Obviously, on one of the legs, I was in by a 1/2 degree. And that's not going to alter the functionality of the legs by any means, but there is a little bit of variance in there, so we got to hunt down the right angles. So with all my angles cut, I could check out how my pretty darn close measurements ended up, and yeah, I'd say that's good enough. Next, it was time to cut the mortises into the legs and rails. And again, because there's a weird angle in there, I just have to mark those out in place. So once I have my references marked, I could go ahead and glue in the tenons for the top of the legs. And I'm doing that now because when I plunge these mortises, they're going to go through my tenons. So it's easier to glue them in now and deal with these as one solid piece rather than trying to avoid the tenons altogether. So with my tenons in place, I could go ahead and plunge those mortises. Now for the rail pieces, because they are a compound miter, I do have to angle the fence on my domino, but only like by 2 or 3 degrees depending on which angle. So here it was just important to label things correctly to make sure I got the correct angle. And that's where color coding my joints really helps out. Otherwise, when we plunge that mortise, it's not going to align properly in the leg, and it's going to give us an incorrect angle for our tenon. And with these things, I never make mistakes. I thought I did once, but I was wrong. Joking, of course. So with that, I could test fit everything together and make sure that my rails and legs fit, and I gotta tell you, I was pretty excited when they did. From there, the last mortises to plunge were the ones that were going to connect my rails to my case, and since we've covered that all pretty thoroughly, I'm just going to quickly run through it here. Now these rail connections might be the most pivotal for the whole thing to work. Because again, we're doing end grain to face grain, we want as much support as we possibly can get. And with these tenons running vertically to the ground, they're probably going to give us the most support out of all these joints. Alright, so with all the joinery wrapped up, I could turn my attention back to the case. And now we're finally ready to fit our front and back panels. So the first thing I'm going to do is use my hand plane to get them to their final width. And then from there, I'll just reference off my case to cut it to its final length. And I'll follow this same process for both the front and rear panels. Once I had the front panel to its final length, I went ahead and laid out the marks for my hinges. Now I'm not going to install my hinges right now, but it's just a lot easier to grab this measurement now than it would be to do after the edges are rounded over. So with my rear panel cut down to its final size, I could finally attach it. And to do that, I'm just going to apply some glue into my rabbet joint and tap it in place. Now as you can see, there's a slight overhang on my panel, so I'm just going to use my random orbit sander to sand that flush once the glue dries. It's always better to leave things a little oversized than it is to shoot for your final dimension right off the get-go. Doing so is like being a Cowboys fan. You know, a 1-star rating. Alright, so next it was time to round over my edges. Now, all the edges on this piece are going to get roundovers, but some are going to get more pronounced ones than others. So for the majority of the piece, I'm going to be putting a 1/4 inch roundover on all my edges. But on some of the roundovers that I want more accentuated, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch roundover. But for now, what I'm going to do is just round everything over with a 1/4 inch bit, so that when I come back with a 1/2 inch bit, I can just take one pass. The other thing this does is it really gives me time to digest my choices, since right now would be a good time to stop if I didn't want to go to a 1/2 inch. And I think that's just something to keep in mind whenever you're building. Try to put checkpoints in so that you can evaluate your work before you decide to go too far with something. Alright, so the next step was to clean up our underside bevel. And to do that, I'll just use a block plane. Now earlier when we cut these over at the table saw, it left a little bit of a hitch in the center because again the surface was curved. So using a block plane allows me to smooth that out and get a really nice finish at the same time. Then the remaining hard edges are softened with a sanding block. I didn't route the 2 transitions that would touch the inside cabinet, and that was because I wanted to make them taper a little, so there I just used a sanding block to flesh that out. And as I mentioned earlier, I just flushed up the back panel using my random orbit sander. And then from there it was back over to the router table to put a 1/4 inch roundover on all of my edges. Here I was just careful to mark the front of the case to make sure I didn't round over those edges. We want those to be flat because the cabinet door will cover those areas. And with the first pass complete, I could swap in my 1/4" bit for my 1/2" bit and then round over those select edges. And really the main corners I'm focusing on here are the outside edge of the legs because I really want to soften that, and the borders of my cabinet Carcass. Now this isn't my first piece doing large roundovers on. The first rounded waterfall edges I did were on the mirror I built a year ago, and I really loved how those turned out, so I've been wanting to do them again ever since, but I hadn't really found the project I wanted to do it to. And because this piece is so round and curvy, I felt like it was the perfect opportunity to give it another shot. And even though these roundovers aren't as deep as they were on the case that I did for the mirror, they still look really good. So with my roundovers rounded over again, I could use a sanding block to clean up my legs. This was a good opportunity to check everything out and make sure that I liked the roundovers and that I didn't want to go any further with them. And since I felt like those were good, I went ahead and cut the pull into my cabinet door. Here what I'm going for is a nice discreet pull, something that's not going to stick out, so a bowl bit in the router table does a great job to conceal that finger hold. All I have to do is press the workpiece into the bit, move down about 4 inches, and then gently pull my piece away. From there I could quickly sand all the roundovers on the piece, as well as the inside edges of the cabinet. Now because I didn't have the door attached to the cabinet, I just went ahead and scribed the corners on the door, and then just used a sanding block to round that over. I felt like doing it this way gave me more natural corners, and I really liked the way they look. From there it was time to attach the hinges. And for the hinges on this one I'm going to be using European style hinges, or Bloom full overlay hinges to be more exact. I'm still a huge fan of the soft close action of Bloom hinges, but am I the only one? I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. Are soft close hinges still as cool to you as they are to me? Let me know down in the comments. If they are, say yes, soft close. If they're not, say no soft close. And as always, if you start your comment with yes or no soft close, I'll reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. Alright, so once I've used my jig to bore out the cup, I then mark out my screw placement inside the case, then use an awl to mark the center point, and attach the mount to the case. Now this little part almost got me in trouble, but thankfully I have a small enough drill to fit within the case. If I didn't, I would have to use one of those 90-degree bits to make it work. And just like my last conversation with the dolphin, the hinges just clicked in place. So with all the heavy lifting done, the only remaining thing to do was glue all my parts together. So on all the parts of my glue up, all I did was just tap in my dominoes into one side first and glue them in place. This way I have less stuff to worry about when I'm gluing all my parts together. Then from there, I could use a combination of mallet taps and clamps and grunts and groans to get all my pieces together. I will say that having a nice big flat surface like this assembly outfeed table we built on the channel in the last episode makes a huge difference. And with that, let me just take a moment to say that if you guys are enjoying this content and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, an invite to the Discord server where we host monthly live chats, and I'm on pretty frequently updating you guys about the work I'm doing. Plus we can talk about what you guys are working on, and who knows, maybe you'll learn something in the process. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to check out the link in the description. And as always, to those of you who've already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your contributions go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. Alright, so at the top of the table and clamps, and my cabinet upside down, I went ahead and added my mark before joining my two pieces together. And that process was the final big hurdle for this project. It's been a long road to get to this point, so seeing these two pieces come together was a really big moment for me. Trying to figure out how to clamp it up was a bit of a puzzle, but after a little brainstorming and some practice, I was able to come up with a configuration that would squeeze everything nice and tight. And then I could say something like, I think it's alright. And then from there, it was finally on to the finish. And for the finish on this one, I'm going to throw it back a little and use some Rubio Monocoat. And I say throw it back because I haven't used Rubio Monocoat in probably about 1.5 years now. But I was walking around looking at some of the other pieces I've used it on, and I really love the way that those are looking today. So I figured it was worth diving into again for this one. So I first sanded my piece to 180, and then I water popped it, sanded it again to 180, and then just removed any excess dust with my vacuum. From there, I apply a little bit of mineral spirits to wipe everything clean, and once that was dry, I could start with the application. Now, one of the things I love about using Rubio is that it's super easy to apply. All I do is apply a thin coat with a Scotch-Brite pad, and then let it sit for a few minutes and wipe the excess off with a shop towel. And Rubio is really great for an application like a table because it's really wear resistant and holds up well against spills and scratches. Plus, it's super easy to repair should it ever need it. So with the finish on, all that was left was the reveal. This just might be my favorite piece I've ever made. And I'm not just saying that because it's the end of the video and I need to make some hurrah moment. I really believe that this is the most complex project that I've ever done. There's a lot of different things going on with this piece that I'm going to dub the CabineTable, and I think that's pretty cool. This is one of my first times really jumping outside the box to try a project that was just close to my heart. And it's always a little intimidating to do something like that because I honestly don't know how it's going to be perceived. I for one absolutely love the teardrop finish on the legs, and I think the rounded waterfall miters turned out beautifully. And the overall stance on the piece has a great weight to it. It doesn't feel like it's going to topple over, but it also feels pretty light, which I think is a nice balance. Not to mention, there's just a lot of other cool details with this piece. The splayed legs were a fun challenge, as well as locating all those pieces in space on the side of the cabinet. It has good strong dado joints, miter joints, and floating tenons, so there's a good mixture of new and old, which I think is perfect for a piece like this, where again my goal was to kind of update something that was mid-century. I can perfectly picture this piece sitting comfortably next to a nice armchair in the center of a room. So if you enjoyed this project and you want to see more like it, make sure you hit subscribe. Check out this video over here next, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you guys next time.